I conducted my study in a fourth grade math class during this last school year, and this study was conducted to see what were the effects of math workshop being implemented in a fourth grade math setting, and I only used it during the skill of adding and subtracting fractions. So it was done over the course of a 5-week period. I had an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group received math instruction involving addition and subtracting the fractions in a small group setting. The control group received that same instruction, just it wasn't a small group setting, it was done whole group. So the study was conducted to compare the results of the two classes to analyze the effects of the math workshop setting, because the only difference between the two classes was that one was taught in a math workshop setting, one was taught whole group. So the research question was, what are the effects of math workshop on student ability to add and subtract fractions? And the rationale behind the study was recognizing the emphasis and importance of student success with fractions. That laid the foundation for the research study, because I was seeking out strategies and interventions that would benefit students with fractional understandings, because I know that's one skill that they really have trouble grasping the concept of. So that's why I chose adding and subtracting fractions for the research. The area of focus was completely in my control, because I was the only fourth grade math teacher, so the only math instruction that the fourth graders got last year was in my classroom, so it was completely in my control. The experimental group of participants were split up into 3 groups of students based on their pre-assessment scores. So at the beginning, the experimental group and the control group took a pre-assessment, and the experimental group that received math workshop, they were split up into 3 instructional groups based on their pre-assessment scores. So one was like a low performing, average, middle performing, and then a high performing. And then students would rotate through 3 math rotations during the math instruction time. Workstation 1 was teacher led. So I led that group. We worked through guided practice on a specific math skill or concept for that day relating to adding and subtracting fractions. Workstation 2 was student-led, where students would work with a partner or a small group on a review from that day or the day before the skills. This workstation often implemented the use of math games, math task worksheets, and or the smart table that I had in my room, where downloaded games already on that, and they could play games related to the skill. And then workstation 3 was used for building fact fluency. So the control group of participants, that was my fourth grade math class that consisted of 7 females and 12 males, all between the ages of 9 and 10 years old. The experimental group was the same age of students. That consisted of 6 males, 8 females. The experimental group did have 4 students that had an IEP and received special education. All 4 received assistance when reading, so any of the math questions related with reading, they received assistance with that, and 2 of the 4 received extended times on the pre-assessment and post-assessment and the formative assessments throughout the 5 weeks. The location of the action research was right here in this room, Nelson County, in my 4th grade classroom in my math class, and it was studied over the course of 5 weeks. So common things. Before I implemented my research in my room, I did some research and looked up articles that had common themes related to anything related to my math workshop. So I knew that math workshop was a small group setting. So one of the common things that I found was student engagement and attitude through the use of small group interaction. And then also the benefits of providing physical movement in the classroom, because with math workshop, the kids are physically moving. Every 15 minutes, they're up and they're rotating. So instead of it being a 60-minute time frame where they're sitting there like the control group was, the experimental group got to rotate, so they got that physical movement. So the student engagement and attitude through the small group instruction, the research that I found on that was, it was an 8-week research that was conducted, and that data showed that students' performance in mathematics as well as their attitude toward mathematics were both affected by exposure to small group settings. This relates to my research question, because math workshop involves students receiving instruction in small group settings. They were broken up and not in one big group. The benefits of providing physical movement in the classroom, according to a study that Jensen did in 2008, establishing a classroom environment that encourages students' movements can improve academic results. It can help remove problematic classroom behaviors and help students focus better on content instruction. This related to my research, because within math workshop, they're rotating every 15 minutes, and I did see some of those same results within mine as far as problematic behaviors. So the data collected, 2 groups of participants were involved in the study, the experimental group, the control group. Those were just kind of chosen at random. I just picked one and went with it. One was controlled, one was experimental. Data was collected through the use of 3 data collection tools. So at the end of my research, I had 3 data collection tools that I could use to review the results. They were used to increase the validity and reliability of the research through triangulation. They all worked together to show what the effects really were. Was it positive effects? Was it negative effects? They were the pre and post assessment, the weekly formative assessments, and a student questionnaire that the experimental group completed at the end. So the pre and post assessments, they were used to show student growth throughout the duration of the study. Obviously, I gave them one at the beginning of the study, I gave them one at the end of the study, and then I kind of just compared the results. The pre-assessment was used to also determine the student's prior knowledge of adding and subtracting fractions, and you're going to see when I get to my results that was really interesting because one of the groups really had more of a basic understanding for adding and subtracting fractions. The pre-assessment scores were used to determine small groups for the intervention because based on their scores they were put in one of the 3 groups that rotated. And at the end of the study, all this data was compared to assist with answering the 1 research question. So formative assessments, they were administered weekly. So once a week, they would get a formative assessment. The control group and the experimental group received the same formative assessment. So they were showing student progress or misunderstandings of specific skills related to adding and subtracting fractions. And both groups of participants were administered the same formative assessments for completion, so I knew that they were showing a more accurate results. The student questionnaire, at the end of the study, student questionnaires were administered to the experimental group of participants to collect qualitative data. This questionnaire was administered to collect student voice and opinions regarding the whole intervention methods and the whole idea of math workshop in the classroom. Each participant answered the following questions based on their experience with math workshop. So the first one, they explained how math workshop has helped them better understand adding and subtracting fractions. They told what the benefits of implementing math workshop in the classroom was versus teaching in whole group, what their thoughts were, and then they just simply answered a yes or no. Would they prefer to learn math skills in a classroom where the math workshop was being implemented? So this is just the data collection table that shows what I did week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and week 5, and they just show that every week I administered a formative assessment to both the same groups, and at the beginning there was a pre-assessment, at the end there was a post-assessment and the questionnaire. So the results, after an extensive evaluation of the qualitative and quantitative data, I concluded that the math workshop did have an impact on student ability to add and subtract fractions. There was a greater increase in the experimental group of participants from pre and post test scores. And from the student questionnaire, it was concluded that math workshop was preferred and that this increased student understanding of adding and subtracting fractions. That was the feedback on the questionnaire. So this shows the results of my pre and post assessment. From the pre-assessment data, it was determined that no participants in either group mastered the skill of adding and subtracting fractions. So I didn't have to differentiate that way. None of them in either group had it completely mastered. And after scoring the pre-assessment, I calculated the average mean from both group scores. It was determined that the mean for the control group was 55% and the mean for the experimental group was 20%. This data was used to determine that no participants had mastered the skill. It was also concluded, though, that the participants in the control group did exhibit a better understanding of the skills. So the control group, they had a better grasp on adding and subtracting fractions overall because their scores were better on the pre-test. And with the post-test, after the completion of the post-test, I calculated the means of the score again. It was determined that the mean for the control group was 77%, the mean for the experimental group was 63%. Although both groups of participants did show growth, it was determined that the experimental group showed a greater increase in growth on their average scores. So the formative assessments results, this shows the pre-assessment, the post-assessment, and all the weeks that the formative assessments were administered. It was determined from these formative assessments that the experimental group of participants had more proficient scores overall on the formative assessments besides week 1. And I think that's because on week 1, obviously that other group had a better understanding. So on that first formative assessment, they obviously scored better they scored better on their pre-assessment. So on that first formative assessment, they still had a better grasp. So they did have more proficiency on that week 1. But the formative assessments from week 1 was administered only after 5 days, and like I said, they scored better on the pre-assessment, so I think that's why they scored better on just week 1, because after that, it showed that the experimental group performed with a higher proficiency than that of the control group. The student questionnaire results. After experiencing math workshop, this pie chart shows that 93% of students would prefer math class be taught in the math workshop setting. Participants revealed on the questionnaire that working in a small group helped them to be less distracted during math class. And they also wrote that they were better able to focus on instruction because it was split up into 15-minute intervals. They went on to add that math workshop was fun. They liked being able to work in stations instead of sitting and working at their desk the whole math class. After analyzing all three data tools and thoroughly examining graphs and figures, it was determined that math workshop did have a positive impact on the effective math workshop when adding and subtracting fractions. The pre and post test revealed that although both groups of participants did show growth, the experimental group had a greater increase in growth from the beginning of the study to the end of the study. Based on the formative assessments data, overall the experimental group had more participants that scored proficiency out of all the weeks than that of the control group. And with all participants sharing positive benefits and explanation of math workshop on their questionnaire, it was evident that the participants thought that the implementation of math workshop had helped them also to gain a better understanding. So all three data tools showed a positive effect of math workshop when adding and subtracting fractions. So what are my next action steps? With positive results from the intervention on the skill of adding and subtracting fractions, I felt like this intervention could easily be implemented during the instruction of other math skills. So that's my plan. Next year I'm going to implement math workshop in both of my 4th grade math classes, and I'm going to use it all throughout the school year and then just kind of compare that. I'll be able to compare that to my control group this year and then see how much it affected it. And although this was conducted in 4th grade math class, the math workshop intervention could easily be implemented into other grade levels to analyze its effectiveness. So maybe 5th grade will do that. And I could share the results of my action research project by presenting at a faculty meeting. So all their teachers in the building can share the results. I can email them a brief explanation to each slide, and I think it'll be easy enough for them to understand and follow along with the gist of the research. And then what I would really like to do is during one of our parent-teacher nights or one of our math night events, or maybe do a bucko event, share some of this with our parents, because when I was getting consent form signed, there were really some parents that were interested in what the research was and what are the results. So I think they would be interested to know the results. So that was quick. Any questions you may have?
Questions. Who was in with the control group? Did it contain the sped?
No, the experimental group has it.
But your control group is the one that showed the most growth.
No, the experimental group showed the most growth. The control group showed the most basic understanding from the pre-assessment.
How did you choose your groups again?
They were chosen at random, and then my math workshop groups were chosen based on their pre-assessment scores.
So next year, if you were to do the same thing, if you were to do this again, would you choose them at random again, or would you specifically use just math centers to see if it actually has an impact on one group over the other?
Yeah, no, I'm going to use the information from this research, and I'm implementing math workshop in
Everything.
both groups. And I like the setup so well, I'm even going to call it science workshop,
Oh, cool.
social studies workshop, and we're going to be doing small groups and
We're doing all
Katie's workshop.
Yeah, Katie's workshop.
Katie's workshop.
It's just going to be Katie's workshop.
Okay, so you said that it had positive effects on behavior. Can you give like a couple examples, maybe something specific?
Well, we had some, especially and that's one reason why it was chosen at random, but I'm kind of glad that my experimental group was with my SPED group, because most of our behavior problems were in there, and I think just the 15-minute switch, they knew that they were going to be able to switch in 15 minutes, so there was less distractions, less calling out. They were staying busy, and they knew just for 15 minutes I have to do this, then I get to do something else. So there was less call outs and less behavior issues that I had to deal with.
Less shares being done.
Yep, less chairs being thrown, less
Trying
things
to
being
use.
destroyed, yep.
Good.
And in that station 2 where they're working with group members, so that kept the time for it all. So that problematic kid, they're the timekeeper, so they have an important job, and they kept the time and they felt important.
Good.
So I think that helped.
So station 2 was in charge of keeping time?
Yep, they kept the time for the whole thing, so I never had to watch the clock, I never did anything. They had cues, and they would let the whole other classmates know when to rotate.
Would you change any of the stations for next time?
I would add a Chromebook station, since we have, what do we have for mine?
Study on.
Study
And
only,
Moby Max.
and add that in to make that a rotation. Then your groups are getting smaller, which could be actually a good thing, if you had 4 groups going.
Mm-hmm.
I know your time decreases, and I don't really have enough time to do one lesson in 2 days, I need to do a lesson a day.
How many centers did you have?
3.
3 centers. How could you, how are you gonna do it with science and social studies?
I'm going to try to integrate writing in that. So one's gonna be a writing, and it may even look like it's gonna have to rotate between social studies and science, and depending on what our tasks are in social studies and science, get some writing in there that way. Any more questions?